Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Prince George's County Government's Office of Community Relations Try Something New Thursday. Sidebar, I tried something new today. I put on some professional attire, which is a little strange in light of everything. So tonight we've convened you so that we can have a conversation about careers and COVID-19 and its impact. In light of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we find ourselves in, we all have been forced to look at new ways of communicating, whether that be educationally, professionally, or just in general. And we realize that we still are very much in a period of uncertainty, but that doesn't mean that we should not start to think about what the future looks like in terms of rededication and redefinition of our journeys, whether those be mental, spiritual, physical, or professional. So in keeping with this, let's have a conversation tonight. And I'd like to do so by bringing up our guest, who is a senior human resources executive with over 20 years experience in the industry. So if you all will virtually wave your hands or clap or snap for me, I'd like to bring forward Mrs. T. Wazo.
Hi, Nicole. Hi, everyone.
Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm definitely looking forward to this. As I mentioned, I did something totally different in keeping with our theme. I put on work attire, and I just want to say that I am really feeling my COVID couture. It's
Yes,
sweatpants and headbands and all of that. So this is
yes.
definitely something new. So without further ado, I want to get into our conversation tonight by asking you an overarching question here, and that is, regardless of your current employment status, whether you're unemployed, employed, transitioning, what is it that you need to be thinking about as we move through this pandemic? And I'm thinking more so of what should be our strategy or approach. Should we have an employment plan? And if so, what does an employment plan entail?
Yeah, so first I want to thank you for having me on here. I think this is a really critical conversation to have, just given the times, given where many people might be in terms of going through just a level of reflection. You talked about earlier about this sort of period being one of introspection. And then, so whether you're thinking about what's next for you, or even people who are actively seeking jobs, right? Because they're facing unemployment. And so I'm hoping that we can get into some really great conversation here. The first question you've asked is a really great one. And, the short answer to that question is, I would highly recommend an employment plan. And then here's why. For anyone who's seeking to find a new job, anyone who is in this just space of unemployment, an unknown, the job seeking or job search experience could be incredibly daunting. It could be extremely frustrating and stressful. And so the employment plan seeks to establish a strategy or plan of action, if you will, which basically allows you to pace yourself. It makes you accountable for specific deliverables, as you see on the screen, and I'll get into these in a second. It also makes your time and makes you a little bit more productive in terms of what it is you're able to accomplish given a specific time period, right? Within a specific time. But I'd also say that as you set out to have an employment plan, it should comprise of 4 key activities, right? Which is what you just saw on the screen. And they're namely research, right? You want to make sure you're making time, you're creating a space to conduct a lot of research. You want to make sure that you're setting goals. You want to make sure that you're creating time to work on your resume. And last but not least, you want to make sure that you are engaging in self-care. And I'll go through each of these just so you know, or you have a better understanding of what these things look like. So with research, ultimately, if you think about what the employment plan is, a specific, targeted, and structured approach, you're thinking about, you want to maximize the most of your time. So ultimately, you want to walk away with an understanding of what the market is, who's hiring, who's recruiting, what are they looking for, the industry you're interested in applying to, what are the hot button topics that are happening in that industry. Another critical component of research is having an understanding of your social capital or your network. What are some of the social connections you have that you can tap into? Because the job market, the reality is it's very different. It's not the way it was 10 years ago. And people are really understanding the strength and the power of connections. And I imagine if we take time to research and think about and reflect on our own personal connections, we'd find that, you know, we're working with quite a bit that we can tap into. So making time for research is important. Making time for setting goals is important, not just big goals. Obviously, your big goal is landing that job, but small goals are just as critical, right? Because you want to make sure, again, given sort of the long stretch that your job search could be, you want to make sure that you're creating a space to celebrate smaller goals and smaller successes, right? To continue to encourage yourself. I think another piece that I talked about was working in your resume. If you're going to take time to create an employment plan, you want to come to terms with the fact that you'll be also spending just a good amount of time, again, being intentional with your marketing tools, with your resume, again, to align what you're bringing to the table to what the employers that you're looking for are seeking. And the final piece was self-care. I cannot emphasize the importance of scheduling time to take breaks, scheduling time to take a breather, scheduling, just giving yourself some time away from the job search. As critical as it is, you want to make sure that you do not experience burnout. You want to make sure that, you know, this experience for you is less daunting, less stressful, and an overall positive experience for you. So those are the 4 critical activities that I think your employment plan should have.
So thank you for that. You've outlined those 4 critical components to your employment plan. And I want to touch on something that you mentioned, which I think is very interesting. It's probably something that professionals like myself, who maybe have a little more settled, have been with, you know, your organization or corporation 10 plus years. You talked about social capital. Can you go into a little bit more detail about social capital? And where I'm going with this is we had the opportunity to speak to a workforce development specialist, and he really put things in perspective for us with regard to how LinkedIn should be used as a networking tool and not as your landing space, if you will, to apply for jobs. So can you speak?
I think social capital is one of the most underutilized, but yet incredibly effective and incredibly powerful tool at our disposal. And ultimately, what it is your social connections. Like who do you have in your wheelhouse? And if you think really critically, you'll find that we all have, just by nature of existing in society, we all have these groups of social networks that we belong to, right? So if you think about the college you attended, you have an alumni network. If you think about even the industry you're in, there's a professional association. The idea, one of the really cool things about LinkedIn is that, you know, it sort of taps into this idea of a social network, you know, by degree of connection, right? So you have first level connection, second level, third level. So in itself, LinkedIn sort of serves as a virtual social capital that not a lot of people really explore, right? So if you think about even the concept of an informational interview, which I find to be incredibly effective, even if you're not actively looking. If you're looking to even just imagine the possibilities of where you'd want to be 2 years from now, informational interviews are just really safe tools that you can use to, again, just explore what's out there, right? So it starts with you identifying a person, because it's ultimately a meeting, it's ultimately a conversation with someone who is in this sort of desired state, whether career-wise, whether company-wise, whether industry-wise, and you reach out to them. Of course, you on your part, you want to make sure you've done your homework. You want to make sure you're very clear with what it is you're looking to get out of the conversation. But, you know, recognizing, I think a lot of people who are very active or even exist on LinkedIn sort of recognize what it's used for, and a lot of times they welcome these opportunities to have these conversations. So I do think LinkedIn makes it incredibly easier. Like if you don't feel comfortable, many of us are not as active in our alumni associations. But again, LinkedIn makes it easy for you to know what those connections look like. Like, you know, if anyone sort of reached out to me from Georgetown or Penn or any sort of institution I've gone to, all they need to do is just mention that they're fellow alum, and I will for sure make out time to speak to them. If anyone and this happens more often than not, just even people that are looking to climb up the human resources profession, the career ladder, and make out time to talk to them. So yes, I think it's a tool. The concept of social capital, the concept of networking, and LinkedIn are really, really key resources that I think people really, really need to be paying attention to and tuning into, especially at this time.
And I would like to say that I think I'm a little guilty here in underutilizing the purpose of LinkedIn. I think I'm weary, like I don't want them to think I'm applying for a job, but listening to the workforce development specialist and yourself, there's a lot of capital, if you will, social wealth that maybe I'm not tapping into, and perhaps others are not tapping into by, not joining LinkedIn or maintaining their account. So with that in mind, I have to start making a pivotal shift, if you will, in terms of where I am now, what I want to do, everything you laid out in an employment plan. And so talk to me about the importance of pivoting positions and understanding, what may work for an entry-level professional may be totally different for a mid-level professional, versus what maybe a seasoned professional may, be looking to do. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So it's so interesting now when I think about career pivots. I always think about Michelle Obama's Becoming, right? Because I don't know if you read the book, but for anyone out there who read it, she pivoted a few times, and I know that she gave people a cause for pause. Like, should I be pivoting? Because she did it so beautifully, and it was so intentional and very measured and very reflective, right? She didn't just get up one day and decide, you know what, I'm sort of tired of this. And let me try something new, right? So we all sort of appreciated that process, right? And I would say that for anyone who's sort of considering pivoting or changing their careers, it's important that they understand why. It's important that there is a driving, that they understand the driving force behind the desire to pivot, right? And so, on the screen here, you say, I ask, what is your big why? And I want to distinguish one's big why from little whys. And the reason I want to do this is, every so often we have bad days at work. Every so often we're in positions where we're not quite feeling our bosses, right? It happens. And sometimes the moments are a lot longer than we desire them to be. But the reality is, when you do make the decision to pivot your career, it's a risk. There's risk involved. And so you want to make sure that the risks involved in sort of transitioning and almost, it's called a pivot because you're making a sort of a sharp, distinct turn in what it is you're doing is well worth the risk. So I'd say, it's important for the person to understand that it's definitely an intentional, methodical process. It's important for the person to understand their big why. For some people, it's I've plateaued in this position because I've been doing it for so long, maybe even by nature of the position. For other people, their reason for pivoting might be, you know what, I'm just not feeling like really and truly, like I don't feel engaged. I don't feel excited. I don't feel energized by this work. I want to do something that makes an impact, right? So these are just examples of big whys that I've heard people share and say. So once you figure that out, and once you recognize that it's time for you to pivot, and this is absolutely what you want to do, the methodical process is then you taking stock of what it is you bring to the table, to this new industry or new career, if you will, that you're looking to get into. And I think oftentimes people have a difficult time, like they feel like whatever it is they're doing, they bring nothing to the table because they've never quite done it before. But I would encourage folks that are in this sort of pivoting mindset to think, like, I feel like if you've done anything, even if you're just starting out in your career, I dare say that you bring strengths to the table. I dare say that you ultimately cultivated or developed certain skill sets. And it's just a matter of being a little bit more reflective. It's just a matter of you thinking maybe a little bit more thoughtfully about what those strengths and skill sets are, so that you're able to translate it and convey them very clearly in the language of this new industry that you're looking to get into. But the second piece of that is there ultimately will be things that you're missing, right? Because again, you're new to this career, you're new to this industry. And so it's a matter of, again, in the spirit of you doing a self-assessment, understanding what these gaps are, being honest with yourself about what these gaps are, and then seeking out ways to close the gaps, right? So I think about the IT industry that's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. And in response to that, there are these new courses that seem to come out all the time that are designed to meet these gaps. And so one simple way that you can close the gap in terms of skill sets you do not have or you do not possess would be taking courses. But then you could also be creative in terms of softer skills and exposure by engaging or exploring the idea of volunteer organizations and being a professional, what we call a professional volunteer, right? Where you engage with an organization. It's usually, it's always, it has to be a nonprofit, a nonprofit that could benefit from skills, right? And you in turn get the exposure, you in turn get to practice in a very real way and explore certain skill sets you had. But all of a sudden you have this line item that you didn't necessarily have in your resume prior. You now have it on your resume because you've been able to cultivate these skill sets through these professional volunteer opportunities. So those would be the things I would recommend. And then of course, finally, networking. A lot of these conversations will likely go back to social capital, exploring who's in these spaces, having conversations, and just even going back to what you had said about, maybe even having this fear of not wanting them to think that you're looking for a job. Oftentimes, when you reach out, you state your purpose, right? Like people are often clear about what it is, and you have to be clear about what it is you're looking for from the informational interview, because they're usually not longer than an hour. So you want to make sure that you're making the most out of it, and you're quite frankly making a really good impression, because you never know when something might come up in that space, right? You don't, that's your opportunity to really make a good impression. But I think first and foremost, informational interviews are designed to be that, a source of information. So these are ways that I think folks could good pivot their careers, especially, and mitigate the inherent risks in doing that.
Good stuff. Good, all good stuff. I just take a moment to go back to you may have a bad day with your boss. Now, as I still adjust to this virtual landscape, let me look into the camera and say, not you, boss. To you, Nisha Davis, Office of Community Relations, and County Executive Angela.
Right. Yeah, you want to clarify. Yeah, absolutely.
But also in keeping with that, you touched upon a lot of good information with respect to marketing your resumes. I particularly like the piece about professional volunteerism and including that on your resume, because in our agency, we find that that's definitely a need, for us, that we seek professional volunteers. And I think that in the line of community work, sometimes people may not even know how to approach us and say, hey, I want to volunteer. And then, the other side is maybe that infrastructure isn't quite where it should be. So I want to take a moment and ask you to speak to the marketing yourself, your resume. There are 4 types we generally identify with. I know there's chronological and, targeted, but speak to what each of those resumes can do, and maybe how you can incorporate a desire to do something that's a little bit, off to the left, if you will, in your resume, like professional volunteering.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, we all know what resumes are designed to do in terms of, they're the age-old way that we market and promote ourselves to prospective employers. And so essentially there are 4 types of resumes that I think I want to highlight. The first is a chronological resume. This is your traditional, you're listing all of your experiences in chronological order, starting with the most recent recent of your work experiences. Now, for a very long time, this was like the preferred way of conveying what it is you have done. It was simple, it was sweet. And this still works for people who relatively have a stable work history, and they tell their work history tells a really nice, clean, consistent story, right? But it may not work for everyone, because, a whole lot of us have been pivoting through the years, right? And just the world is very different, and we have lots of opportunities, accessible to us, and we're constantly being encouraged to live our best lives, right? So I think more and more hiring managers and employers I think the other types of resumes are having more traction and greater appeal, right? So which leads me to the second type of resume, the functional resume. This resume probably, I want to say downplay, even though that's not the best term, but the focus or the emphasis is not so much on your work history. It's more on the skill set. So the story you're telling about yourself is a little bit different. It's really about the skill sets you bring to the table, right? And so that's sort of what you highlight. That's the prominent feature on the resume, and then it follows sort of a brief listing of the specific roles you've had and when you've had them. But again, the focus there is on the skill sets. So I think the functional resume is the best type of resume for folks who either do not have an extensive work experience, or for folks who are looking to pivot, right? Because like I mentioned, what you're highlighting in when you're pivoting is not the fact that you do not have prior experience in this area, but you're really leading with what you have. And so the functional resume, I think, is the best way for you for one to present themselves in the best light. It's also really good for people who don't have sweet, clean, consistent work histories, either because it's an extensive their extensive employment gaps on their resume, or they've done quite a lot of things, right? And so the functional resume allows you to sort of tie the things you've done together across skill sets, right? So the focus again is I have accomplished these skill sets, prominent feature through these work experiences, not so prominent feature, right? Because they're different. So it allows folks to really focus on what it is you're bringing to the table. And then I think more and more people, we're seeing more combination resumes. The combination resumes are essentially a hybrid between the chronological resume and the functional resume. And this is why I think it has more appeal, because one, it allows you to, again, market or promote your skill sets in a very easily accessible way, where you're sort of starting off with, this is what I bring to the table. But then you're sort of substantiating and backing all of that up with, and this is how I bring it to the table. These are the experiences and the specific things I've done that sort of support these skill sets that I'm saying that I bring to the table, right? And so more and more, I think you're having people kind of, present combination resumes. And of course, the fourth resume is the targeted resume. It's just as the name describes. And I think this is arguably the most time-consuming type of resume out there, where you are taking a job description and you're creating a resume in the same language or similar language as the job description, right? So you're almost making it easy for the hiring manager to see that you are the right person for this job. And I'll say that, oftentimes I encourage or recommend a targeted resume for what I would call your dream job. Like if there are jobs that you just feel so strongly, right? Because the goal is not to embellish. You want to make sure you've done what it is. It's a matter of crafting and using similar language in the same way that the job description is written. And even though it takes, just a little bit more time to customize your resume to that degree, for some roles, it's worth you taking the time to do that, right? And if you have factored your employment plan and sort of factored time into customizing your resume, it's not this sort of, oh, now I have to do this, because you have a plan that has allowed you to create space and time for you to put in the work to create a targeted resume. So that's how all four resumes are typically used, and sort of how you might want to put your best foot forward, depending on where you are in the job market. You could find yourself using all four, depending on the story you're telling and to whom, in terms of the types of positions you're going for. So, yeah.
So of course I knew we were going to, do this session, and we prepared for it, but I honestly feel like you're speaking, directly to me, because a lot of this is things that I'm considering now, particularly in light of COVID, in terms of having more visibility as a community professional. And then, perhaps as I move to embarking upon becoming an adjunct professor somewhere, which is my goal. But all of that said, you still want to represent, whether that's face-to-face or virtually. So I'm going to put my glasses on. I probably should have done that at the beginning, because I'm pretending like I can see. Anyway, I just want to ask you, if you could give us some, friendly FYIs with regard to how you conduct interviews in this virtual space, whether it be the HR professional, HR generalist, whomever conducting the interview, or whether you are the candidate like I am, who didn't put my glasses on, who is actually being interviewed.
Yeah, so for what it's worth, I didn't notice that you even needed glasses, so you're doing really really great. But yeah, I love that you framed the question in a way that the advice is for both the HR professional, like the interviewer, and the interviewee.
Yes.
Because I think both parties do have to come to the table prepared. Obviously, the onus is on the person being interviewed more so than the interviewer. But at the end of the day, both parties need to exude professionalism. And it's an incredibly timely question because virtual interviews are the order of the day, right? So the first thing I'd say is just the importance of being prepared for the interview. A lot of the advice I'd give are probably just as relevant for in-person interviews. Again, just going back, the beauty of an employment plan is if you've sort of done all the things you're supposed to be doing, by the time you get to the interview stage, this is just, like the preparation for the interview would be your research. If you had been sort of, again, doing the homework and the activities and all that good stuff, you want to know about the job, right? You want to show up with a strong knowledge and understanding of the job requirements. You also want to be able to articulate how your background and experience, right? So they have your resume, but you kind of want to bridge the gap for the hiring professional, right? So that's part of the research you want to do. But I think where some people may fall short is maybe stopping there with their preparation. I would go a little bit further and say you want to understand the company, you want to understand their mission, vision, products, what they're about. Going even further, you want to understand the industry that the company is positioned in. If they're a nonprofit, you want to understand the space that they exist in, their positioning in that space. You want to have a sense of the hot button topics again in that area, industry trends, things people are talking about. It just makes you stand out a little bit more in terms of your ability to add real value to what's already happening in the organization. So, I mean, that again, it sort of goes beyond whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, whether it's over the phone. You want to make sure you show up and you show out because you've worked so hard on your employment plan, you've worked so hard researching, you worked so hard self-caring, right? So you want to make sure that when you get the interview, you close the deal by being super prepared. The next, I guess, things that I would recommend have to do with sort of the virtual space, finding the right space to have this interview, a well-lit area, a quiet space, one that's free of distractions. That's also important. The third sort of advice I'd give is showing up, dressing up professionally, like we both are doing right now. Exactly, we both showed up ready. And so that's what you want to do, especially if within the context of an interview, you're representing yourself. And so the order of the day, like I said, is professionalism. And so you want to make sure that you're presenting yourself as such. And then other things, I'd say still close out the interview as you would in an in-person interview with a post-interview follow-up. A thank you email. Those things are still considered best practices, even in the midst of COVID. I'd say even more so because, I mean, sometimes we sort of lose the art of some of these traditional best practices are still well in play. You want to make sure that you, again, come across as a really strong candidate that brings real value. Oh, thank you. There were a couple more that I may have missed, so let me touch on them. Okay. Speaking of virtual interviews, testing your technology is key. Again, on both ends, right? Because now you get points taken off because it sort of makes you look like you're not well prepared for the interview. Because if you didn't think to test your technology, then it's like, how does that translate to the workplace, right? And then the last piece, which I think is really important, is building rapport with the interviewer. I think it's really, some people say it's hard to build rapport when, through virtual conversations. And folks say, you almost have to work that much harder. Whatever the case is, you want to figure out how best to do it, right? So that you are representing the best version of yourself in that interaction and in that dynamic.
Well, I want to just say that when you were going through all of those tips, I was cringing when you got to the part about find a quiet space free from distraction, because I'm like, okay, any minute now, somebody's just going to bust in.
Same here.
Yeah.
But we're doing great.
So yeah, I was going, who crisis.
Right.
But with regard to showing up and showing out, you certainly have done that this evening. We're getting really close to our wrap time. So I want to ask you one last question before we go, and that is, are there any tools, organizations, resources that you would like to share with our virtual attendees that they can follow up and have this information?
Yeah, so I didn't want to, job boards are always key, but I feel like they would probably know more about what job boards are. There's just always something going on. And so I don't know that I have exponentially that much more to share. I listed a couple here. I do think that what I do want to emphasize and I do want to highlight again is the importance of networking resources, which I've listed probably many more of that than job boards. So again, professional associations, industry groups, industries that you are in now and industries that you might be looking to transition into. It's a matter of doing that research to see what's out there. There's so many professional associations out there that, beyond what you can think of. For us, HR professionals, it's SHRM, but there's one for administrative professionals, there's one for development professionals. There's just so many out there. And I think that, if you're not actively involved in a relevant professional association, you're doing yourself a disservice because you're sort of not as, you're missing out on opportunities that exist out there. I think I also mentioned alumni associations, but
Yeah.
beyond that, universities and career service centers are charged with your career success. So they exist to make sure you're successful in your chosen career. And so I'd recommend, this isn't an area that a lot of people feel like they can do. Maybe they don't think about it often, but I'd recommend reaching out to see what resources that they have going on. I know that, some universities do a better job than others in making sure that, they have a wide reach and they're staying in contact with their alumni. And, and I think I'm sort of compounding too. So there's your alumni association and then there's your career services office. Both are equally great resources for you to follow. Volunteer organizations I just talked about. I think Nicole put in a plug about volunteering for her agency and organization. So for sure, follow up because they need you. And I know they're doing lots of awesome activities and programming, and this happens to be one of them. So for sure, be sure to connect with them after this. Social media, we talked about LinkedIn. But there's also Instagram. I mean, it's so amazing, the amazing things that these social media platforms are doing beyond what we typically know them to do. There are tons of Instagram lives that organizations and influencers and experts have been issuing, even in terms of connections, right? When I know sliding into one's DM is a negative connotation, but it could be positive depending. And again, it's a matter of you stating your purpose, right? So again, in the spirit of making meaningful connections, it's a matter of thinking and being intentional and being creative in a respectful and a professional way, in the spirit of learning what may exist out there, right? So I already talked about county resources. There's Employ Prince George's, which is something I was thinking of. I know they have job fairs. They have lots of networking, job skills development. It's a workforce development organization. So there are tons of resources out there, but I wanted to maybe highlight the ones that, folks don't traditionally think about to complement the ones that, people might be more in tune with, right? So that way you have like a balanced flow of information.
That was awesome. You just gave me a perfect segue into this next part. Unfortunately, we don't have any theme music, so I'll just snap my fingers and
okay. I'm
pull up the next slide with our commercial break. All of the we want to let the community know. Number one, we have a Safe Dates Digital Academy. We will have our third session this coming Tuesday. It's from 1 to 2 p.m. This is a healthy space for our young people to convene and talk about healthy relationships, things to look out for in terms of what's healthy and what's not healthy in a relationship. And to your point, Mrs. Nwazo, you mentioned self-care. This is just that opportunity for you to kind of take a moment and just decompress, but have a meaningful conversation. So I'm gonna snap my fingers and see if we can get the final slide going, because we have another one. And I think our census baby will be featured, because we want to give everybody that reminder to please complete their 2020 census. We have a goal of getting to 85% or better completion. Look at our census baby, Jalen.
Yes, that
And
is it.
Jalen needs you to complete that census, because 10 years from now in 2030, what we do today will inform what happens with Jalen and everyone else in 2030. So we definitely need you to get that energy going and complete your census. And Mrs. Nwazo, you gave a great plug for next week's guest, Walter Simmons from Employ Prince George's. So we will have him featured here in this same time, same virtual space next Thursday. And I thank you for giving me that plug. I thank you for giving me a very well thought out professional interview this evening. And I hope that our participants got something from this session. So again, we appreciate you joining us. We ask that you be safe. Thank you again for your professionalism and your years of experience in trying to compress that into this half an hour virtual space. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you again. Be safe, and please remember to wear your mask.